Let's talk about the glories of Imperial Russia. Up until the late 17th century, Russia was predominantly agrarian. It was almost entirely agricultural. It was one of the less sophisticated of the large countries in the world. Now, it was still, under Peter the Great especially, this is Peter the Great here, Peter the Great was the first of the great czars in terms of, he was a great military campaigner, he conquered more lands. He was the one that brought Russia to the place of being the largest geographical nation in the world, or country in the world. However, for being the largest country in the world, in 1600s, during Peter's time, there were only 14 million people in Russia. Later on, it would become the third largest country in the world by population as well, but even though it was the largest country in the world in terms of physical size, there were not that many people living here, and virtually all of them were involved in agriculture. Most of them were serfs. Now, a serf, if we don't use that term as much, serfdom is a kind of slavery, but it's slavery in which the workers, the farmers in this case, are attached to the land rather to an individual. They are connected to the land, they are required to work the land, and therefore are required to work for whoever it is that owns the land. In this case, the early Russian nobility were called the boyars. And if they sold a piece of property to a different nobleman, then the serfs went with it. But they had passed laws in Russia that the serfs could not leave the land they were on. They really were indentured to that piece of property, and they had to work for the lord that owned that property. They were also surprisingly heavily taxed. Both the serfs and the merchant class, the sort of very small middle class in Russia, were taxed very heavily, which meant that there were constant uprisings. There were revolts every 15 years or so, 15 or 20 years, they would have a major peasant revolt because of the being virtually in slavery and then also being required to pay taxes. Now, this continued until really Peter the Great comes along, and he was a very strong leader. He's the one that brought a new autocracy into Russia. Peter the Great became enamored of the other great countries of Europe, especially France. He had visited France. When he came back from there, he decided that he was going to remake Russia from being this fairly primitive, by comparison, agrarian society into being a major world power, consistent with what he thought was their potential as the largest geographical country in the world. So he proceeded to create a new autocracy, a new nobility. He instituted a completely different kind of government where he got rid of the old ruling class and put in place a structured government with ministries to control it and that sort of thing. He really worked very hard. One of the things he did in terms of his conquest, Russia had been isolated. They didn't have any warm water seaports at that point. The only seaports they had were only usable 3 or 4 months of the year because they were frozen the rest of the time. And so he conquered area around the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, which allowed them then to have access to the rest of Europe. And that made a huge difference. In 1703, Peter the Great founded what would become Russia's new capital. Moscow had been the capital. That was St. Petersburg. It was named for him. And he called St. Petersburg the window that opened upon Europe, because being on the Baltic Sea...
Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking to you from the bridge.
We got a call.
We've now got everybody on board. We're picking up the gangway. Engines will be all ready to go shortly. And then we'll start slipping the lines and heading out through the narrow passage out towards the fairway, towards St. Petersburg in Russia, where we pick up the pilot at 5:30 tomorrow morning, after we've got 180 miles to make it to the pilot station. And then, of course, once we pick the pilot up tomorrow morning, about 5:30, we should be alongside approximately 8:30 in the morning, which will give the authorities a chance to clear us all, so as everybody can enjoy their 2 days in St. Petersburg. And due to the narrow passage on the way out, we won't be setting the sails right away. We will play our signature sail away 1492 Conquest of Paradise as we're moving out, which is always a nice touch. And then, of course, as soon as we drop the pilot off and we're in the clear, we will start setting our sails. We'll probably play the signature music yet again. That just leaves me to wish you a wonderful afternoon here on board the Windsurf. Thank you very much.
we'll all hum along to Vangelis if it comes over the speakers, okay? So, picking up again, St. Petersburg was founded by Peter the Great. He, and then 40 years after Peter died, there were several people who took over. He was the first emperor. He declared himself the emperor of the Empire of Russia. That was when the Russian Empire came into being in 1721. Well, Peter started bringing in all sorts of Western experts and scientists and philosophers and engineers, and then there were 40 years after him where things just sort of coasted until the next really significant and powerful leader, perhaps the most important leader for the history of Imperial Russia, came along, and that was a woman, Catherine the Great. Now, her name wasn't Catherine and she wasn't Russian, but other than that, she fit right in. She was actually German. She married the German heir because royal families in those days obviously intermarried a lot, so she married the German heir, who was Peter III, and then had him killed, to give you the short version. Peter III was not very stable. He was not a very good leader. People loved Catherine and they wanted to follow her leadership, and so how much she directly was involved in arranging the assassination of her husband, we don't know for sure, but he was assassinated. She had herself, she had the Orthodox priests declare her the sole ruler of Russia, and she ended up ruling for longer than any other female from 1762 to 1796. So she was in power for 34 years. She followed along the same ideas that Peter the Great 40 years earlier had, in that she brought in a lot of Western experts. She was a great patron of the arts. She she was considered a huge fan of the Enlightenment, which means she supported the Enlightenment movement. She was kind of a personal fan of Voltaire and Diderot and some of the other French encyclopedists, they're called. And she really did work to try to institute the Enlightenment ideas of intellectual pursuit. She founded the first institution specifically oriented toward educating women that had ever been created, the Smolensk Institute. And she funded it so that it continued after her. So she really did push these ideas, these ideals of education, the Enlightenment, science, and learning. She was also a huge patron of the arts. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but it was her personal art collection that became the Hermitage Museum. And that's why it's in the Winter Palace, which was the royal palace of the Tsars and Tsarinas of Russia. So, under Catherine the Great, Russia really did become revitalized in terms of achieving what Peter the Great had wanted, and that is to become equal to the great powers of Europe. In fact, during Catherine's rule, Russia became recognized as not only one of the great powers, but perhaps the greatest of the powers of Russia during the time in the 1700s when she was in charge of it. They actually refer to this as the Catherinian era because of the changes that she made. She also, there are all sorts of legends about how she died, which I don't think we can get into or talk about. I don't see anybody, you apparently haven't heard those legends, having to do with a horse. But she did have multiple lovers. You know, she was enlightened in a lot more ways than one. And she had a number of noble court favorites. Count Orlov, Count Potemkin were two of them, and interestingly enough, one of them, Count Potemkin, when their relationship started to wane, Potemkin actively worked to try to gain her a new paramour, you know, to find the right person to take his place as her lover. And so she was quite extraordinary. She was the one that really instituted the building of the great mansions. There had been some of the palaces that existed before. She was a big fan of the classical style of architecture, which is what you're going to see in the Winter Palace and in Catherine's Palace. Catherine's Palace is not named for Catherine the Great. She technically is Catherine II, but Catherine I was the wife of Peter the Great, and she's the one, Peter created the Catherine's Palace for his wife. But then later on, of course, since she was the Tsarina later, Catherine II came in and she completely remodeled it. It had been in a Baroque style and she changed it to the classical style, which she was a big fan of. As I say, she was a big patron of the arts, of literature, of education. She herself was a writer. She wrote comedies and fiction and memoirs. She never met Voltaire face to face, but they conducted a correspondence for over 15 years. And when he died in 1778, she went into a period of mourning because they had had such a sense of relationship and fellowship. And when the French were giving the Enlightenment thinkers in France a hard time, she invited them, if they wanted to come to Russia, where they would have the freedom to do whatever they wanted. So I mentioned that the Hermitage Museum, how many of you all have ever been to the Hermitage? Okay, good. If you haven't gone, go. All right? Full stop. You need to go to the Hermitage Museum. It is the largest museum in the world and the oldest museum in the world. They have the largest collection of artwork anywhere. And the best of what they have is considered the equivalent of the best of what the Louvre has. It is quite extraordinary. Now, this picture up here, this is the waterfront picture of what now constitutes the Hermitage Museum. There are 6 buildings in the Winter Palace complex. 5 of them are open to the public. And going from left to right here, you have the Hermitage Theater, the Old Hermitage, the Small Hermitage, and then the Winter Palace. And then there's another building called the New Hermitage, which was built right behind this Old Hermitage. You can't see it from here. But together, these are the Hermitage complex. It is the, again, the Winter Palace, the original residence of Catherine the Great. The collections that exist there, they have over 3 million items. Obviously, most of them cannot be on display at any one time. About a third of those are part of their numismatic collection, which are their coins, because she was a big fan of coins and medals, and so there are a lot of those there as well. But in addition to this center, there are other museums of porcelain and other things around St. Petersburg that are connected with it. And there are several exhibition centers that are related to the Hermitage abroad, so that you have them in some other major cities. There are the Hermitage Museum of this place and that place and whatnot, so that they have so much they're able to show it in other places. Now, this collection that is now the Hermitage collection began in 1764 when Catherine the Great began to collect art. She first bought a collection of paintings that had been put together by a Berlin merchant named Johann Ernst Gazkowski. He had put together a collection of paintings for Frederick of Prussia, Frederick II of Prussia. And then Frederick decided he didn't want it, so Catherine bought it. And there are conflicting accounts. It was either 225 or 317 paintings. And when we say paintings, that included Rembrandt, Rubens, Jacob Jordaens, Van Dyck's, Paolo Veronese, Franz Hals, Hans Holbein, Titian, Raphael, Jan Stein, and many others. An extraordinary collection of paintings just to get started on the thing. From that point on, most of them were Dutch and Flemish, but a few others as well. From that point on, Catherine started buying up collections of people who died. It seemed like that these wealthy people would put together these collections, and when they died, their children didn't want them. So in 1769, she purchased 600 paintings from Bruhl's collection in Saxony. In 1779, she purchased 198 premium paintings from Robert Walpole in London. Before she was done, during her lifetime, Catherine acquired 4,000 paintings, 38,000 books, 10,000 engraved gems, 10,000 drawings, 16,000 coins and medals, and 2 full galleries full of natural history collection. It was the greatest personal collection in history. After her death, they continued to add to that. And these are all just pictures of some of the galleries and things in the Hermitage. Because this was the Winter Palace, the building itself, the rooms in the Hermitage are extraordinary. And then they're filled with all of this art and extraordinary things. So if you haven't been there before, you really do need to go. If you have any value for art or anything else, and I assume that if you're on a trip like this, then you do value travel and art and that kind of stuff. So this is the kind of the legacy of the art glory that Imperial Russia has passed down to us, primarily because of what began with Catherine. Now, it didn't end with her. After her death, because she had started the ball rolling, other of the czars and czarinas continued to collect art. Of course, when the communist takeover in 1917, they ended up trying to sell a lot of this stuff. Stalin, for instance, sold a considerable number of the Fabergé eggs that were given to the royal family of Russia. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But in addition to the art, St. Petersburg is known for its extraordinary palaces. These are images from Peterhof Palace. Peterhof was the summer palace of Peter the Great. So it goes back before even Catherine the Great. It was, as I mentioned, Peter the Great had gone to France. He was enamored of France. He loved French design. He loved the whole French court style. That's one of the things that motivated when he came back. He wanted to compete with the French court, the great courts of Europe, and so that's why he made so many changes. And when he came back, his palace was already being built. He had it modified because of a lot of things that he picked up from his visit to Versailles. And if you look at the images there, the fountains, the basic structure of the building, you can see similarities between it and Versailles. There are 1,500 acres of formal gardens and parks. He visited Versailles in 1717, and they finished building this a number of years after that. There, in addition to 1,500 acres of formal gardens and parks, there are 173 fountains on the property, and it's an extraordinary complex of buildings that are part of the mansion there. Now, these buildings were almost completely destroyed during the siege of Leningrad. In fact, the Peterhof, the summer palace of Peter the Great, was probably halfway destroyed. And so it had to be rebuilt, and now they have brought it back to its original glory. Now, Peterhof is about 18 miles outside of St. Petersburg itself, but we have trips going to it. If you haven't made your final decision on some of the St. Petersburg trips, this is one of the options you might seriously want to consider. Here are some other images from Peterhof. You get sort of the outside. Originally, there were 200 pounds of gold were used to gild the outside, the gilded areas on the outside of the buildings. Most of that now is just gold paint. The gold was too valuable, and the Soviets especially were very interested in trying to generate as much cash as they could. There are a number of enormous, spectacular dining rooms there. The original throne room of Peter the Great. Just extraordinary things. The architect for this was actually the same architect as the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and so you'll see similarities there. That same sort of carryover from Versailles. I come from Kentucky originally, and there's a town in Kentucky called Versailles. They also have a New Berlin. It's very strange. So I have trouble pronouncing things sometimes. So this, you get an idea of the extraordinary aspect of this. Here's some other pictures from it. The portrait gallery of his relatives and other friends. You get an idea of the gilded effect. This is from the palace itself, looking down to the Bay of Finland down there. So just extraordinary. These equal the most beautiful of the palaces of France or of Germany. A beautiful thing. The Grand Cascade, which is the area with all the fountains here, has 37 bronze sculptures, 64 fountains, and 142 water jets. So quite extraordinary. The other major palace, which is in the town of Pushkin, is the Catherine Palace. Again, this was a palace that was given to Catherine the First, not Catherine the Great, who was the wife of Peter the Great. It's still considered one of the world's great palatial royal residences. Like Peterhof, it was significantly destroyed in the Second World War. The army group north of the Germans, when they left, they looted all of these palaces and then tried their best to destroy them, and yet they have been rebuilt. It is Catherine's palace that is the home of the famous Amber Room. The Amber Room, I'll talk about in just a second, but Catherine's Palace, the reconstruction, 57 of the major halls within this building had been destroyed by the Nazis. And yet they have all been rebuilt now. It took them many, many years to do it, but it's all been rebuilt. Originally it was in a Baroque style, but then when Catherine the Great came along, she had it remodeled into the neoclassical style that she liked the building itself is 2,427 feet long. Now that's a house, okay? So imagine, that's like half a mile almost. Okay, it's close to half a mile long, this one building. Now this was the summer residence of Catherine first, and then of the Tsars and Tsarina. So they had the winter palace was in St. Petersburg, and then about 14 miles away they had the summer palace. So they didn't go very far for vacation. Just we're going down to the beach house, which this was their beach cottage apparently. Some of the interior, the most spectacular room, of course, that is best known is the Amber Room. This is a reproduction of the Amber Room. The original Amber Room was called the Eighth Wonder of the World. Peter the Great had been in Germany and was visiting with King Frederick, what we call Germany, King Frederick William of Prussia, and he admired this sort of amber cabinet, which meant a very small room, that Frederick of Prussia, and in response, because they were allies, Frederick gave it to Peter. He had it taken apart and sent to St. Petersburg. Well, Peter the Great liked it so much that he had the whole thing expanded into what became a 590 square foot room. There are 16-foot panels of amber. Now this has all been reproduced. This was all stolen by the Nazis and it was lost. We never did find out what happened to it. Some people believe that it may have been in Königsberg Castle when it was bombed and it was all destroyed. There are a lot of Russians who believe this is still in somebody's private collection in Germany or somewhere else in the world, and nobody will talk about it. But the original one was destroyed. It was reproduced later on. It took them from 1979 to 2003 to redo this. So 24 years to try to reproduce this. It's 100,000 separate pieces of amber that are fit together like jigsaw puzzles. And to create this room, it's been estimated that this room is valued at over $500 million. So it's $500 million worth of amber. It is amber with glass and mirror. It is lit by candlelight. It's quite extraordinary. I have never seen this because we didn't have access to it when we were there. So we didn't get to Catherine's palace. But this is an opportunity for you to see the extraordinary amber room. And it was a study. I don't know that I could concentrate if I had a study that looked like that, but this was the study that Peter the Great used in his wife's home. Here are some other images. There are 5 gold domes over the chapel area. The Great Hall, as it's called, or the main ballroom, is the whole width of the building and is big enough that they would have massive balls in this place. You can see there are outside buildings as well. Just extraordinary things that you can have an opportunity to see. If you can make it there, I strongly recommend it to you. Now, in addition to these extraordinary buildings that they had and the extraordinary collections of art, the crown jewels of Russia are considered perhaps the most extraordinary crown jewels in the world. And again, like some of the other treasures of Imperial Russia, some of them have been lost. In fact, some of them were lost, some of them were regained, some of them have never been recovered. This is Catherine the Great, and you'll see the crown here. This is the imperial crown that was designed for Catherine the Great, and the scepter that she had. She actually had this scepter changed later to embed in it the Orloff diamond, which was given to her by one of her lovers, Count Orloff. But this is what we're talking about. This is the same crown, the same one you saw in the previous picture. This was created for her in order for her to wear it in the coronation. It is set with 5,000 select Indian diamonds and a number of very large white pearls. The red spindle at the top of it is 398 carats. This is incalculable, the amount that this stuff is worth. These are other crowns and orbs and scepters that were created prior to that. This is actually the oldest of the crowns they have. It is ermine with a gold and jeweled top. This is called the cap of Monomat, which was back in the days when the Mongols ruled this part of the world, when the kings of Russia were crowned, they would use this, which is an Eastern style hat. They have to periodically replace the ermine because it decays, but the gold cap and jewels and everything remains the same. And so this is called the diamond throne because it's a chair embedded all the way around with diamonds. This is the ivory throne, made of ivory. Various of the emperors, the kings, the czars, czarinas at various times would have special items made for their coronation. And they felt like this established them as being truly leaders of a world power. Here are some of the jewels. This is called the Shah. This jewel, it's 88.7 carat. It's a bar-shaped diamond from India. We know it has 3 engravings on it, and the oldest of them is from 1051. It was owned by the same guy who built the Taj Mahal for his wife. And his wife, whose name was Mumtaz Mahal, she wore this with a cord. There's a place that's grooved in it that there was a cord designed, and they have paintings of her wearing this as a necklace. And it came down eventually to the czars in Russia. This is a red gold orb with an enormous sapphire at the top of it, as you can see, and diamonds. This is the same thing here. That's the Orloff diamond. There's an extraordinary story behind this Orloff diamond. Count Orloff gave this to Catherine the Great, his lover. And it's, to this day, they're not quite sure where it came from originally. The Orloff diamond is believed, it's by the way 189.6 metric carats. It's believed that it may have been part of what was originally called the Great Mogul diamond from more than 1,000 years ago, that may have become the Koh-i-Noor diamond, that may have become another diamond which is called the Dar-i-Noor, and all of these famous diamonds just disappear. Nobody knows where they go, and then these other diamonds come up, and it's believed that they all may have been cuttings from the same large diamonds originally. And so we have extraordinary stories about where these things came from, that the Dar-i-Noor or Koh-i-Noor, what became the Orloff diamond, may have been an eye of a Hindu idol at one point, that a Frenchman spent years he converted to Hinduism and spent years becoming accepted by the Hindu community so that he could be allowed into the innermost part of the temple, and he ended up stealing one of the eyes, and later on became the Orloff diamond. But you can imagine the value of these things, just the age and the weight of these various pieces. We also have the Fabergé collection. Most people think of Fabergé as being French. Originally it was Russian. The original founder of the Fabergé family was from St. Petersburg, Peter Karl Fabergé. And between 1885 and 1917, when the Russian Revolution happened, he was creating these extraordinary, one-of-a-kind jeweled gifts for the Tsars of Russia, particularly for Alexander III and then Nicholas II, who was the last of the Tsars, of course, who was thrown out of power and assassinated with the Russian Revolution. But the House of Fabergé created 50 of these Imperial Easter eggs. And they would give them as gifts at Easter, and there were several requirements. One, they had to be one of a kind. Secondly, they all had to have a surprise. For instance, this is the Peter the Great egg, and when you open the top of it, there's a tiny golden carving of Peter the Great on horseback. Some of them, one of the most famous ones, when you opened up the egg, it had the coronation coach in jewels inside of it. So we have 43 of those 50 are now in existence. The other 7, we don't know what happened to them, what with war and that sort of thing. He actually made more than that. He made 65 total Fabergé eggs, but of them 50 of those were for the Imperial family of Russia. If you have been to Moscow or go to Moscow to the Kremlin armory, where they have various of the treasures of the imperial families on show. They now have, I think, 9 of these there that you can see. Stalin sold 7 of them. There have been Armand Hammer had a collection of a few of them at one point. The Malcolm Forbes of the Forbes newspaper, who ran for president a few years ago, he had a collection, the largest collection of them. He had 9 of them at one time. So, but extraordinary things, and all of these are part of the treasures. This is Nicholas II, a diamond-encrusted Fabergé medallion with his portrait in it. This is just a brooch, a scarab brooch that was created in jeweled glass. So, extraordinary treasures. The Russian Tsars, starting with Peter, and Tsarina with Catherine the Great, were trying to prove that they were as sophisticated and as wealthy and as much to be respected and regarded and held in awe even as the French or the other great courts of Europe. And so this is one of the ways they did it, and these treasures still exist for us to see today. Okay, any questions about any of that? I don't claim to be a jeweler or to have extraordinary knowledge about this, but any questions about any of the royal families or the collections? If you haven't been to the Hermitage, I hope you've been inspired now to try to make it there. And if you can't make it this trip, I hope you'll come back, because it is, we've been there before and I'm looking forward to going again. So plan on being there. Any questions? And there they sat stunned for some moments. Yes?
Were the buildings designed by Italians or French architects?
They actually had an Italian architect that had come over and was responsible first for the Winter Palace. And then he ended up, and then a lot of changes were made later, but the same designer that they had was responsible for the Winter Palace and also for Peterhof, and I think he also did Catherine's Palace. So you do see similarities in them, and that similarity carries over from Versailles as well. You can see some similarities in the building style. Yes?
Diamond cutting, a lot was done in Amsterdam now.
Right.
Where was it done in those days? Did they have their own cutters?
Well, but there were different places that they did it. It's interesting that the Orloff diamond, when they had it cut at one point, the Tsar who had them, he was going to have it refined because it didn't have very much fire at that point. The guy who cut it, who was a Russian, he thought he was going to get rewarded, and in fact the Tsar was so disappointed he thought he had ruined it, and so he charged him 100,000 whatever it was, the money units at that time, basically everything he had, and took it somewhere else, and they ended up losing more of the jewel because they had to then have it cleaned up. But yeah, there are other places. There's a lot of diamond cutting in Israel, I know, so in Amsterdam and Israel and other places. Where the specifics of these, most of these were cut 800, 1,000 years ago. These are some of the most premier diamonds in the whole world, and so it's not like they have done it just recently. There are a couple of diamonds that are in the crown jewels of Britain that were found in the 20th century, so we do know more about those. But these are very ancient gemstones. Anything else? Well, thank you very much.